Hello booktubers. I'm going to look at a writer who is probably familiar to most of you. His reputation is monumental, really, but he's very easy to read. You don't always get the two things together, do you? And it's the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges. Not sure of my pronunciation, but I'll do my best. And rather than talk about him and give a survey of all his work, I'm going to focus on one story, which the first time I read it made a big impression. It's just beautifully constructed. I've got two editions. That one, Personal Anthology, edited and translated by Anthony Kerrigan. And then the Collected Fictions, complete works really, which is Penguin, and a new translation by Andrew Hurley. On the back of this, Maria Vargas Llosa says, "I'm quite aware of how ephemeral literary assessments may prove, but in Borges' case, I do not consider it rash to acclaim him as the most important thing to happen to imaginative writing in the Spanish language in modern times, and as one of the most memorable artists of our age." Yeah, memorable, that's true. And then Umberto Eco says, "Though so different in style, two writers have offered us an image for the next millennium, Joyce and Borges. The first designed with words, what the second designed with ideas. The original, the one and only World Wide Web, the real thing. The rest will remain merely virtual." That's funny, Umberto Eco talking about the World Wide Web there. Because his fictions, as you probably know, they do involve a kind of, often a web-like imagery. The huge libraries that open onto more and more rooms and more books, and labyrinths and those kind of things, where you're led off in all kinds of directions, and that's particularly characteristic of his work. I suppose you would you call it fantasy? Fantasy writing. And of course, you'll know Borges was blind, but he was still the director of the National Library of Argentina in Buenos Aires. Amazing, really. He had a love of English literature. His favourite writer was Robert Louis Stevenson. And he wrote poetry, but he also wrote these short pieces. They call them fictions, and they're very very imaginative, very strange sometimes, and totally original. They strike me as that anyway, intriguing and mesmeric, really. He wrote I remember somebody told me about him when I was, I'd never heard of him when I was in my 20s. And I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. And I started to find some stories. And one in particular, it's called The Secret Miracle, really got into my head. And I remember I sort of learnt it, really. Not word for word, but and I would sometimes tell it to people and they would go quiet. It had that power. But I think I'm going to read it out. I don't know how successful my reading voice will be. And these are two different translations, but they're very similar. It's hard to choose which one. I don't think one is better than another. But the last time I did a video, I did it about Alone in Berlin by Hans Fallada, and this there's a sort of link. So yeah, I'm going to read this out. I'll do my best. I hope you enjoy it, and see how we go. The Secret Miracle. There's a preface. And God caused him to die for 100 years, and then raised him to life. And God said, "How long hast thou waited?" He said, "I've waited a day, a part of a day." That's from the Quran. So that's the sort of little bit at the beginning of it. Anyway, this is the story. On the night of March the 14th, 1939, in an apartment on Prague's Zeltnergasse, Jaromír Hladik, author of the unfinished tragedy The Enemies, a book titled A Vindication of Eternity, and a study of Jacob Boehm's indirect Jewish sources, dreamed of a long game of chess. The game was played not by two individuals, but by two illustrious families. It had been started many centuries in the past. No one could say what the forgotten prize was to be, but it was rumoured to be vast, perhaps even infinite. The chess pieces and the chessboard themselves were in a secret tower. Jaromír, in the dream, was the firstborn son of one of the contending families. The clocks chimed the hour of the inescapable game. The dreamer was running across the sand of a desert in the rain, but he could recall neither the figures nor the rules of chess. At that point, Hladik awoke. The din of the rain and the terrible clocks ceased. A rhythmic and unanimous sound, punctuated by the barking of orders, rose from the Zeltnergasse. It was sunrise, and the armoured vanguard of the Third Reich was rolling into Prague. On the 19th, the authorities received a report from an informer. That same day, toward dusk, Jaromír Hladik was arrested. He was led to a white septic jail on the opposite bank of the Moldau. He was unable to refute even one of the Gestapo's charges. His mother's family name was Yaroslavsky. He came of Jewish blood. His article on Boehme dealt with a Jewish subject. His was one of the accusing signatures appended to a protest against the Anschluss. In 1928, he had translated the Sefer Yetzirah for Hermann Barsdorf Publishers. That company's effusive catalogue had exaggerated, as commercial catalogues do, the translator's renown. The catalogue had been perused by Captain Julius Roth, one of the officers in whose hands his fate now lay. There is no one who outside his own area of knowledge is not credulous. 2 or 3 adjectives in fracto were enough to persuade Julius Roth of Hladik's preeminence, and therefore that he should be put to death. Pour encourager les autres. The date was set for March 29 at 9 a.m. That delay, whose importance the reader will soon discover, was caused by the administrative desire to work impersonally and deliberately, as vegetables do, or planets. Hladik's first emotion was simple terror. He reflected that he wouldn't have quailed at being hanged, or decapitated, or having his throat slit, but being shot by a firing squad was unbearable. In vain he told himself 1,000 times that the pure and universal act of dying was what ought to strike fear, not the concrete circumstances of it. And yet Hladik never wearied of picturing to himself those circumstances. Absurdly, he tried to foresee every variation. He anticipated the process endlessly from the sleepless dawn to the mysterious discharge of the rifles. Long before the day that Julius Roth had set, Hladík had died hundreds of deaths. Standing in courtyards whose shapes and angles ran the entire gamut of geometry, shot down by soldiers of changing faces and varying numbers, who sometimes took aim at him from afar, sometimes from quite near. He faced his imaginary executions with true fear, perhaps with true courage. Each enactment lasted several seconds. When the circle was closed, Hladík would return unendingly to the shivering eve of his death. Then it occurred to him that reality seldom coincides with the way we envision it beforehand. He inferred with perverse logic that to foresee any particular detail is in fact to prevent its happening. Trusting in that frail magic, he began to invent horrible details so that they would not occur. Naturally, he wound up fearing that these details might be prophetic. Miserable in the night, he tried to buttress his courage somehow on the fleeting stuff of time. He knew that time was rushing towards the morning of March the 29th. He reasoned aloud, "It is now the night of the 22nd. So long as this night and 6 more last, I am invulnerable, immortal." He mused that the nights he slept were deep, dim cisterns into which he could sink. Sometimes impatiently he yearned for the shots that would end his life once and for all, the blast that would redeem him for good or ill from his vain imaginings. On the 28th, as the last rays of the sun were glimmering on the high bars of his window, he was diverted from these abject thoughts by the image of his play, The Enemies. Hladík was past 40. Apart from a few friends and many routines, the problematic pursuit of literature constituted the whole of his life. Like every writer, he measured other men's virtues by what they had accomplished, yet asked that other men measure him by what he planned some day to do. All the books he had sent to the press left him with complex regret. Into his articles on the work of Boehm, Ibn Ezra and Flood he had poured mere diligence, application. Into his translation of the Sefer Yetzirah, oversight, weariness and conjecture. He judged a vindication of eternity to be less unsatisfactory, perhaps. The first volume documents the diverse eternities that mankind has invented, from Parmenides' static being to Hinton's modifiable past. The second denies, with Francis Bradley, that all the events of the universe constitute a temporal series. It argues that the number of humankind's possible experiences is not infinite, and that a single repetition is sufficient to prove that time is a fallacy. Unfortunately, no less fallacious are the arguments that prove that fallacy. Hladík was in the habit of ticking them off with a certain disdainful perplexity. He had also drafted a cycle of expressionist poems. These, to the poet's confusion, appeared in a 1924 anthology, and there was never a subsequent anthology that didn't inherit them. With his verse drama, The Enemies, Hladík believed he could redeem himself from all that equivocal and languid past. He admired verse in drama because it does not allow the spectators to forget unreality, which is a condition of art. This play observed the unities of time, place and action. It took place in Hradčany, in the library of Baron Romerstadt, on one of the last evenings of the 19th century. In Act 1, Scene 1, a stranger pays a visit to Romerstadt. A clock strikes 7. A vehemence of last sunlight exalts the window panes. On a breeze float the ecstatic notes of a familiar Hungarian melody. This visit is followed by others. The Persons who come to importune Romerstadt are strangers to him, though he has the uneasy sense that he has seen them before, perhaps in a dream. All fawn upon him, but it is clear, first to the play's audience, then to the Baron himself, that they are secret enemies, sworn to his destruction. Romerstadt manages to check or fend off their complex intrigues. In the dialogue they allude to his fiancée, Julia de Wiedenau, and to one Yaroslav Kubin, who once importuned her with his love. Kubin has now gone mad and believes himself to be Romerstadt. The dangers mount. By the end of the second act, Romerstadt finds himself forced to kill one of the conspirators. Then the third and last act begins. Little by little, incoherences multiply. Actors come back on stage who had apparently been discarded from the plot. For one instant, the man that Romerstadt kills returns. Someone points out that the hour has grown no later. The clock strikes 7. Upon the high window panes, the western sunlight shimmers. The thrilling Hungarian melody floats upon the air. The first interlocutor comes on stage again and repeats the same words he spoke in Act 1, Scene 1. Without the least surprise or astonishment, Romerstadt talks with him. The audience realises that Romerstadt is the pitiable Yaroslav Kubin. The play has not taken place. It's the circular delirium that Kubin endlessly experiences and re-experiences. Hladik had never asked himself whether this tragic comedy of errors was banal or admirable, carefully plotted or accidental. In the design I have outlined here, he had intuitively hit upon the best way of hiding his shortcomings and giving full play to his strengths, the possibility of rescuing, albeit symbolically, that which was fundamental to his life. He had finished the first act and one or another scene of the third. The metrical nature of the play allowed him to go over it continually, correcting the hexameters without a manuscript. It occurred to him that he still had 2 acts to go, yet very soon he was to die. In the darkness he spoke with God. If, he prayed, I do somehow exist, if I am not one of thy repetitions or errata, then I exist as the author of the enemies. In order to complete that play which can justify me and justify thee as well, I need 1 more year. Grant me those days, thou who art the centuries and time itself. It was the last night, the most monstrous night, but 10 minutes later, sleep flooded Hladik like some dark ocean. Toward dawn, he dreamed that he was in hiding in one of the naves of the Clementine Library. What are you looking for? A librarian wearing dark glasses asked him. I'm looking for God, Hladik replied. God, the librarian said, is in one of the letters on one of the pages of one of the 400,000 volumes in the Clementine. My parents and my parents' parents searched for that letter. I myself have gone blind searching for it. He removed his spectacles and Hladik saw his eyes, which were dead. A reader came in to return an atlas. This atlas is worthless, he said, and handed it to Hladik. Hladik opened it at random. He saw a map of India, a dizzying page. Suddenly certain, he touched one of the tiny letters. A voice that was everywhere spoke to him. The time for your labour has been granted. Here Hladik awoke. He remembered that the dreams of men belong to God, and that Maimonides had written that the words of a dream, when they are clear and distinct, and one cannot see who spoke them, are holy. Hladik put his clothes on. 2 soldiers entered the cell and ordered him to follow them. From inside his cell, Hladik had thought that when he emerged he would see a maze of galleries, stairways and wings. Reality was not so rich. He and the soldiers made their way down a single iron staircase into a rear yard. Several soldiers, some with their uniforms unbuttoned, were looking over a motorcycle, arguing about it. The sergeant looked at his watch. It was 8:44. They had to wait until 9. Hladek, feeling more insignificant than ill-fortune, sat down on a pile of firewood. He noticed the soldier's eyes avoided his own. To make the wait easier, the sergeant handed him a cigarette. Hladek did not smoke. He accepted the cigarette out of courtesy or out of humility. When he lighted it, he saw that his hands were trembling. The day clouded over. The soldiers were speaking in low voices, as though he were already dead. Vainly he tried to recall the woman that Julia Divider now had symbolised. The firing squad fell in, lined up straight. Hladek, standing against the prison wall, awaited the discharge. Someone was afraid the wall would be spattered with blood. The prisoner was ordered to come forward a few steps. Absurdly, Hladek was reminded of the preliminary shufflings about of photographers. A heavy drop of rain grazed Hladek's temple and rolled slowly down his cheek. The sergeant called out the final order. The physical universe stopped. The weapons converged upon Hladek, but the men who were to kill him were immobile. The sergeant's arms seemed to freeze, eternal, in an inconclusive gesture. On one of the paving stones of the yard, a bee cast a motionless shadow. As though in a painting, the wind had died. Hladek attempted to scream, a syllable, that twisting of a hand. He realised that he was paralysed. He could hear not the slightest murmur of the halted world. I am in hell, he thought. I am dead. Then, I am mad, he thought. And then, time has halted. Then he reflected that if that were true, his thoughts would have halted as well. He tried to test this conjecture. He repeated, without moving his lips, Virgil's mysterious fourth eclogue. He imagined that the now remote soldiers must be as disturbed by this as he was. He wished he could communicate with them. He was surprised and puzzled to feel neither the slightest weariness nor any faintness from his long immobility. After an indeterminate time he slept. When he awoke, the world was still motionless and muffled. The drop of water still hung on his cheek. On the yard there still hung the shadow of the bee. In the air, the smoke from the cigarette he'd smoked had never wafted away. And another of those days passed before Hladek understood. He had asked God for an entire year in which to finish his work. God, in his omnipotence, had granted him a year. God had performed for him a secret miracle. The German bullet would kill him at the determined hour. But in Hladek's mind, a year would pass between the order to fire and the discharge of the rifles. From perplexity, Hladek moved to stupor, from stupor to resignation, from resignation to sudden gratitude. He had no documents but his memory. The fact that he had to learn each hexameter as he added it imposed upon him a providential strictness, unsuspected by those who essay and then forget vague provisional paragraphs. He did not work for posterity, nor did he work for God, whose literary preferences were largely unknown to him. Painstakingly, motionlessly, secretly, he forged in time his grand invisible labyrinth. He redid the third act twice. He struck out one and another overly obvious symbol, the repeated chimings of the clock, the music. No detail was irksome to him. He cut, condensed, expanded. In some cases he decided the original version should stand. He came to love the courtyard, the prison. One of the faces that stood before him altered his conception of Romerstadt's character. He discovered that the hard-won cacophonies that were so alarming to Flaubert are mere visual superstitions, weaknesses and irritations of the written, not the sounded word. He completed his play, Only a single epithet was left to be decided upon now. He found it. The drop of water rolled down his cheek. He began a maddened cry. He shook his head, and the fourfold volley felled him. Jaromir Hladík died on the 29th of March at 9:02 a.m. So, The Secret Miracle, written in 1943. Yeah, it's wonderful. So much going on. I'm struck by how powerful that thing about the condemned man, imagining the various scenarios. You know, I suppose if you're condemned like that, he's got a week to live. The mind's gonna churn over all this, and it has it has a great power. The idea that if you imagine it won't happen, because reality is always different. You know, that's so strong. And the mystery of the play. And of course, Borges's insistence of the importance of literature and the imagination. And it doesn't matter. He's saying it doesn't matter whether anybody hears it, reads it. He says, is it for God? He doesn't know what God's literary preferences are. It's simply its own existence that justifies it. And that's true of all art. You know, if you were an artist, a creator, you definitely want people to experience what you've done and appreciate it, but at the same time, it's more noble if you're just doing it for its own sake, I suppose. Anyway, I love that story, and I don't know how successful my reading of it was, but I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for now. Bye.